So today I decided I would react to one of WhatIfAltHistory's videos, Understanding Islamic Civilization. Now, I'm kind of familiar with WhatIfAltHistory. I've seen some of his videos on the ancient Near East. I think he did one on ancient Mesopotamia, and then I've seen I think another video of his about the classical world, or uh, actually the video suggested they're understanding classical civilization. I think I've seen part of that. Um, Also, I think I've seen a few of his like speculative, what if this empire arises, or what if, um, or like future empires, or how, certain cultures and civilizations could form empires in the future, that sort of thing. So he does a lot of speculative or alternative history, as his channel name of his channel suggests. And you guys might know him, and I think he's well known, well known for his debate with Vaush, where in my opinion, he absolutely wiped the floor with him. Vaush couldn't really address his points, or he couldn't, rebut any of the citations he had about uh, how different social justice movements they're clearly different in where they're what sort of ideologies they're influenced by. Um, Bosch didn't really make the case that there's a continuous trajectory of social justice from the abolitionists to today's like Black Lives Matter movement. But yeah, overall, I thought, what if what if alt history handily won that debate? But yeah, I mean, in my opinion, I think what if alt history has some good videos. Um, Obviously, some of them are really speculative. Um, he's kind of got a reputation on like some of the history subreddits about like certain stuff he gets wrong. Um, and yeah, and I think um, he kind of has a reputation of sort of classifying civilizations a certain way, and uh, you know, creating maps, creating maps a certain way. But um, but yeah, regardless, I wanted to check this video out and see what I think of it.
This is the last major world civilization of the big ones that are around today, and I'm excited to cover it for that reason. This
Wait, what?
doesn't mean this is
Hold on.
this is the last major world civilization of the big ones that are around today, and I'm excited to cover it for that reason. This do-
I mean that. I mean, maybe I misheard, but that sounded kind of weird. The last major civilization. I mean, I don't know. I guess. I mean, I would consider America and the West a major civilization. Maybe he is including that, but I kind of listened. That just sounded weird.
this is the last major world civilization of the big ones that are around today, and I'm excited to cover it for that reason. This doesn't mean this is going to be the last of the civilization videos, since these are honestly my favorite of all videos to make. And so I'm going to have some new civilizations like communism,
Maybe he meant like the last of his major, massive world civilization, modern world civilization videos. Okay.
cover some smaller ones like the Jews or Tibetans, and go back further into ancient history as well. However, of the four big Eurasian civilizations, Islam or the Middle East is in some ways the most recent, but also the oldest in others. Islam has over a billion adherents around the world today, and the civilization to which it is attached has billion adherents.
Um, I mean, I don't know if I would 100% agree with that. Um, if he's including China or the Far East and Western, or he's using Europe as like a synonym for Western civilization, I would say obviously both of those are quite a bit older than Islamic civilization. I mean, uh, Far East or Chinese civilization is a couple thousand years older than Islamic civilization, as uh, it goes back all the way to the Yellow River uh, civilization of the Fertile Crescent. And then obviously Western civilization started with uh, the Greek city-states or ancient Greece, and that's about a millennia or two older than Islamic civilization, roughly. Um, but maybe, I mean, I guess maybe he means that Islamic civilization is in some aspects older. So maybe like how it takes, how it's influenced by certain cultures, such as the ancient Israelites or, uh, you know, pre-Islamic Arabian culture, but we'll see.
The Middle East is in some ways the most recent, but also the oldest in others. Islam has over a billion adherents around the world today, and the civilization to which it is attached has changed the world in an irrevocable manner. This video is its story.
All right, I'm gonna skip this sponsor
.com
or
slash WhatIfAltHist or Muslim world, or the region that stretches. This video is going to cover the main Middle Eastern North African area of the Muslim world, or the region that stretches from Morocco to Pakistan. I'm not going to cover the Malay Archipelago since I already did that in my video on Southeast Asia, and I'm going to cover the Sahel in a future video on African civilizations. For both Southeast Asia and the Sahel, they are Muslim, however I don't count them as the same civilization, given they are geographically thousands of miles away from the Middle Eastern North African region, while also being geographically and ethnically distinct. They all had their own native, completely different civilizations, whose elites largely decided to label themselves as Islamic in order to be more geographically
I'm gonna
thousands
go
of
back.
miles away from the civilizations. For both Southeast Asia and the Sahel, they are Muslim, however I don't count them as the same civilization, given they are geographically thousands of miles away.
I mean, it's a good point there. I wouldn't consider like the West African, like the Sub-Saharan African, West African Muslim countries or the Horn of Africa cultures or countries such as Somalia as part of North Africa or the Middle East or part of the Islamic civilization because I mean, even though they did convert, there's obviously they have much there's like obviously much different cultures uh that sort of synchronize that sort of yeah sort of synchronize with the Muslim influence and um yeah they there's not a whole lot of overlap culturally between the sub-Saharan African Muslim countries and North African Middle East Muslim countries.
Away from the Middle Eastern North African region, while also being
Like
geographically.
you wouldn't say that something like the Mali Empire was a carbon copy or nearly identical to like the Abbasid Caliphate or uh, El Andalus or Islamic Spain. Like it, they had a different, for example, like a different law code and um, a different, you know, different pre-Islamic culture that still had very much had an influence. In fact, there were when uh, Persian and Arab travelers made contact with the Mali Empire, and specifically when uh, uh, Muslim writers from the Arab world would make contact with the Mali Empire, they would write about how culturally different, and there was like a culture shock when these Arab writers from the Middle East and North Africa came into contact with the Mali Empire, and they would write about these cultural differences.
And ethnically distinct. They all had their own native, completely different civilizations, whose elites largely decided to label themselves as Islamic in order to be more global. It's funny to talk.
And it's interesting that he brings that up. I mean, that's a good point because, for example, in the East African swap, like this is more in the late 19th, mid to late 19th century. Um, in the East African uh, Swahili civilization, um, there there was a ruling class of elites who were, genetically sub-Saharan African, and they engaged in slave trade. Prime example is the individual Tibu Tip who owned like more slaves than anyone in the American South. Um, but someone like Tibu Tip would identify as Arab or and both Arab and Muslim, and would distinguish himself from the Zanj or uh, other sub-Saharan Africans who weren't Muslim. Like he would, so basically he adopted the Arab identity and the Muslim identity, but he was not genetically from the Arabian Peninsula. So, yeah, I think it's good. I think that's interesting that What If Alt History brings that up because that is a phenomenon that occurs in you know like the West African Muslim countries and um, the East African Muslim countries. You do have ruling or native elites who identify as Arab and Muslim.
Native, completely different civilizations whose elites largely decided to label themselves as Islamic in order to be more global. It's funny to talk to Europeans given they have a pretty unhappy relationship with Islam, given
I think that's in large part due to the things like the Syrian refugee crisis of the 2010s and certain issues that's causing within Western Europe. Um, there are stories about um, but how widespread this is. I mean, personally, I don't know, but there are stories about refugees from Muslim countries like raping European women, and that causes, even though these are isolated cases, that's causing a lot of that and sort of the pouring in of refugees and sort of the clash of cultures or sort of like the clash of cultures that's sort of causing a lot of tension between Europeans and these refugees.
Islam, given they've been their top competitor for centuries and their countries have some problems with Muslims today. However,
Oh yeah, and here are the stats. There does seem to be a noticeable amount of crime committed, and like the perpetrators are mostly like refugees from Muslim countries or immigrants from Muslim countries. Um, that's not to say to paint it with a broad brush regarding refugees and immigrants from that are coming from these countries, but I think um, and I'm not as familiar with the way the media or news works within various Western European countries, but probably these crimes get a lot of airtime, and that causes a lot of anxiety um, for Western Europeans, and then sort of creates like a clash of cultures.
Islam is actually one of my favorite civilizations. I just find them very compelling. I grew up in the wake of 9/11.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been interested in the medieval Islamic world, especially Islamic Spain, because at certain points, especially under the Ibn al-Rahman, uh, Muslims, Jews, and Christians were actually they were actually able to tolerate one another and live in I don't want to say harmony, but relative peace compared to other times in like other areas of the medieval world. Um, but yeah, always been intrigued by excuse me. I've always been intrigued by the Islamic Spain and the medieval Islamic world because medieval Islamic civilization, along with the Byzantine Empire, it's interesting to look at the contrast between these both of these sophisticated civilizations and sort of the backwater that was Western Europe, especially Europe, especially during the early and first part of the High Middle Ages, um, due to after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, uh, Western Europe was fragmented between various barbarian tribes who had settled in various parts of the former Western Roman Empire. But I don't want to go on a tangent. But point is, uh, I guess to sort of use a, uh, I guess to use sort of a metaphor or imagery, the light still shone on the civilizations of Byzantium and the Islamic world, while uh, in Western Europe was still recovering.
Where radical Islam, not unfairly, was portrayed as the bad guy. However, I was always curious about what radical Islam had going for it, where it was able to convince so many young men to commit suicide.
Be honest, I should do more reading on modern cases of uh, men uh, being. Uh, yeah, I should like read more on like people converting to or being influenced by jihadism or uh, getting brainwashed into joining the jihadist cause. Um, but off the top of my head, I would say the reason why that even whether it be, you know, people, poorer peoples from the Arab world or even like upper class educated people from the Arab world and the West, because as Sam Harris pointed out, there are examples of like doctors from the Midwest of the United States joining ISIS or like these jihadist groups, even though they're not victims or uh, they don't feel the effects of the American wars in Iraq and the American wars of in Iraq and Afghanistan, um, and there's no reason for them to be angry with America because they're living in America and they're doing quite well. Yet still they convert to jihadism, and and something else that a lot of people don't know is that the hijack the hijackers who flew the planes into the World Trade Center, they weren't like these backwards people from like the middle of the Arabian desert. They were actually college educated and well off and like upper class. But um but I would say, the one major reason that comes to mind is uh with jihadism there's the promise of getting into paradise if you know commit to waging jihad and spreading Islam by the sword, so to speak. And I think that appeals to a, a certain or certain people or some people.
For it. I've been to Tunisia, Turkey, Egypt, and Qatar. One of the biggest running jokes on this show is how into the possibility of a future Turkish empire I am. Although
And there's an example of what if alt history is like speculative future. What if Turkey has another empire? Like that, I know he does a lot of like simulations of potential empires that could arise in the future.
she's an American of British ancestry, my mom grew up in Iran and has told me lots of stories about it. Muslim countries are fascinating in how they're different from the West, but at the same time, of the main Eurasian civilizations, they're by far the closest to us.
Uh, I mean, I guess that's true. I mean, probably due to the Islamic civilization. The religion is obviously an Abraham member, one of the three Abrahamic faiths, and also with Islamic civilization, uh, they, along with the West, were influenced by Greco-Roman civilization in the areas of the sciences, math, uh, even somewhat architecture, and the in addition to the Byzantine Empire, the Arab Muslim world during the Middle Ages were the ones that copied down uh, texts from classical antiquity, such as those of Aristotle, and preserved these classical texts. And anyone who's familiar with medieval history, that's and early modern history, that's how um, the West was able to rediscover, so to speak, the texts of the ancient Greeks and Romans, which in turn is one of the reasons that the Renaissance gets started. But yeah, the Western Europeans that after the Crusades they came home with various Greco-Roman texts, and during the Reconquista of Spain by the Christians, Iberians, along the way they would come into contact, like once they conquered um, a city or a territory in Al-Andalus, they would come into contact with uh, Greco-Roman texts that have been copied and preserved in Arabic, and they would just have these translated into their respective languages.
We both follow Abrahamic religions that worship the same God. We're both heirs to the Greeks and the Romans in our own
No, yeah, he makes the same points that I do.
ways, and the Middle East and Europe are genetically the same race.
Um, I kind of get what he's saying, but I wouldn't generalize or say it like that. And I would say that that isn't 100% accurate because you although um the Arabs and peoples from the Middle East and North Africa, they have a lot of Neolithic early first farmer DNA, as do Southern Europeans and a lot of Western Europeans. um, like you wouldn't say let Scandinavians and peoples from the Middle East and North Africa are part of quote unquote the same race because they're clearly genetically distinct. You can tell, like if you had two genomes, one from uh, the Middle East and one from like Sweden, you could tell the difference. And obviously they're phenotypically different. But yeah, like was and also Europe's not really a genetic monolith, so to speak. Like the example of Scandinavians, they have more like Eurasian steppe ancestry and probably some earlier early European hunter gatherer as well. And I think peoples from the British Isles have a lot of uh, um, Western European hunter gatherer from the Pleistocene or Paleolithic, and then they also have a lot of ancestry from like the Caucasus steppe region due to the Celtics or Celts migrating into the British Isles. Now you could say that peoples from the Middle East and North Africa have a lot of genetic overlap the with Southern Europeans, such as Spaniards and Italians and Sicilians and Greeks, because they all share uh, I guess the best way to put it is they share a common ancestry that goes back to the first farmers of the ancient Near East during the Neolithic during the Neolithic Revolution. These Neolithic farmers spread through into Asia Minor and then eventually made their way into Greece and then um, uh, Italy, what is today Italy and Spain. Um, so yeah, basically there was demic diffusion that went on there and and I'm of the position that demic diffusion did go on with the first farmers of the Middle East going into North Africa as well. Um, but and also there's all probably even more genetic exchange with Neolithic peoples from Spain migrating into North Africa. There is archaeological and genetic evidence that peoples from the Neolithic Iberian Peninsula migrating into North Africa, and then peoples from the what is today Sicily during the Neolithic migrating into Tunisia. This is evidenced by the obsidian trade that was going on during the Neolithic era. But yeah, that's all, overall. That's just to say that you can make the case that um, if you go back far enough, there's a lot of genetic overlap between Southern Europeans, North Africans, and Middle Easterners. And you could say, quote unquote, they're part of more or less the same race, but I wouldn't say Europeans in general because um, I'm gonna guess that Slavic peoples and people from like Russia, there's a lot more like Eurasian steppe ancestry. And then obviously, there's so many things popping into my head, and so many directions we can go with the genetic ties between peoples from Central Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. But um, there also, with the Indo-European expansion, there's sort of a genetic link between people from Iran and Western Europe because they all speak Indo-European languages. Um, but that's the thing. A lot of people is from the Middle East and North Africa and Saudi Arabia. They speak Afro-Asiatic languages, uh, specifically Semitic and uh, the Semitic languages because they speak Arabic, and there are obviously other ancient languages that were part of the Semitic family branch, and the Afro-Asiatic family branch. But yeah, regardless, there's there's a different set of ancestry there as well. But um,
This is a video to explain the civilization that in some ways is a bizarre mirror image of the West. Islam is the youngest of the four main civilizations in Eurasia, but its roots also go the deepest. The Middle East really is the graveyard of civilizations, given that for civilization's first 3,000 years, it was mostly just in the Middle East.
um, I mean, obviously he's highlighting the various civilizations of the ancient Near East. Um, but it's I don't know, kind of. I mean, depending on if he's this is supposed to be all the Bronze Age or Iron Age civilizations, or if he's combining the two. Um, I mean, maybe I'm just nitpicking, but if we're talking Bronze Age civilizations, you wouldn't call what is, the area of what is today Phoenicia and or what is today Lebanon and Israel, Phoenicians and Jews. These would be the Canaanite or West Semitic civilizations and city states, such as Ugarit and Megiddo and what is today Israel. So I wouldn't use Phoenician or Jews. And Jews, that seems kind of anachronistic if we're talking about the ancient Near East, because um, name the name using Jews to describe the peoples from uh, Israel. Um, you don't see that until the post-Babylonian exile. Interesting enough, the Persians were the first ones to call them the Jews. Um, and this is during the Persian era of the history of ancient Israel. But um, I mean, I would, I think the correct term would be Israelites or Judahites, or you could say the Hebrews. But yeah, I think because the Persians first were the first ones to to call them the Jews, and this was post Babylonian exile. I wouldn't use that to describe this civilization right here. And then the Phoenicians were also more Iron Age. I would broadly categorize this as Canaanite or West Semitic. And then, yeah, Syrian, kind of anachronistic too. I would, because there were city states such as Ebla and Mari, and then further north you have like the Mitanni kingdom as well. So I don't know if you'd call it. I mean, yeah, I guess I'm just nitpicking, but
This region had Elamite, Mesopotamian, Jewish, Egyptian, Phoenician, Aramaean, Hittite, Armenian, Greek,
oh, and also the Aramaean. So he does mention it. But maybe I'm nitpicking a bit.
Roman, and other societies before the Muslims arrived. The Muslims started in the middle of the map in an area where the game had been playing for a very, very long time. Lots of trajectory that ended up with Islam had been bumping around for thousands of years before Muhammad and eventually were pulled together from obscurity to form the supernova that completely changed the world. The ultimate way to understand the Middle East, or the constant that's lasted for thousands of years, irrespective of whatever nations and ethnic groups sit on them at any given time, is the geography. And geographically, there are three separate Middle Easts. The first one is the mountainous regions of Persia, Armenia, and Turkey. This area is mountainous enough to be able to make hard men that are good.
And yeah, I should point out that the mountains did actually uh did help the Hittite Empire in uh their defense strategy because it wasn't as easy to penetrate their empire or their territory because as what if all history says, this region's very mountainous.
Good warriors, but also is arable enough to support large populations. This region has ruled the Middle East for the majority of the last warriors, but also is arable enough to. And geographically, there are three separate Middle Easts. The first one is the mountainous regions of Persia, Armenia, and Turkey. This area is mountainous enough to be able to make hard men that are good warriors, but also is.
Um, I mean, not saying I don't want to say he's wrong, but couldn't the argument also be made that because Iran has contact with the steppes that you know they yeah, because they have contact with like steppe nomads that forces them in that they have to defend their civilization from like raids from these no steppe nomads and warriors that trains them to become better warriors and have a better military, but also you know people migrating in from the steppes as well. You know that uh, that gives um, the Persian civilization better mounted warriors. I mean, yeah, maybe. I mean, I get his point, but I think you know it also has to be taken into consideration the um that Iran or Persia's contact with the steppe nomads, and also um I would say that maybe the Hittites the reason they have like better warriors or they had strong warriors is because they had to constantly defend their territory from powerful kingdoms such as the Mitanni, and they had to build up their military to eventually conquer the Mitanni kingdom and also Syria, or what is today Syria. But um,
Arable enough to support large populations. This region has ruled the Middle East for the majority of the last 20.
and also because the Hittite Empire was so pretty large, they had to constantly deal with like rebellions from within or uprisings, and then also various uprisings and rebellions within their Syrian territory as well.
500 years. At the time of Muhammad, a combination of the Persians and Greeks, who were based out of Anatolia, had ruled the civilized Middle East for 1,000 years straight.
Yeah, and as he's pointing out, I think it's important when you're talking about the sort of backdrop or the context of the rise of Islam and the Arab tribes getting united. The two major superpowers at the time was the Eastern Roman Empire or Byzantine Empire and the Sasanian, Sassanid, or Neo-Persian Empire. And they, prior to Islam spreading throughout the Middle East and North Africa, they had just fought like a major war, and um, the Sasanian or Sassanid Empire took control of Syria briefly, and then the Byzantine Empire had to win it back. Uh, and in the end, this ended up draining the resources of the Byzantine Empire, and this war drained the resources of the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Empire.
The second area is the Fertile Crescent, or a strip of flat, farmable land stretching in an arc from southern Iraq to Egypt. This was largely the setting of the Bronze Age cycle of history, with
I mean, I know he's only talking about the Middle East, but it should be pointed out the Fertile Crescent also includes the Indus Valley and Yellow River civilizations as well, which
countless
are in modern day Pakistan, um, or the northern part of South Asia and China, respectively.
Empires fighting tooth and nail before burning themselves out in 500 BC and being conquered by Persia. This area was extremely wealthy at the time of Muhammad, but also politically subservient. The native peoples are Semites relatives of the Arabs. The third geographic area being the deserts of wealthy at the time of Muhammad, but also politically subservient. The native peoples are Semites relatives of the Arabs.
Um, for the most part, yeah, if we're talking about the ancient Near East, but certain groups, since he's including the Elamites, their language is a language isolate, so they were not Semitic. Um, now, and the origins of the Elamites is a mystery, as is their language. And also, we're talking about Mesopotamia. The Sumerians were not Semites. They spoke a completely different language that's also a language isolate. Um, and and also technically the Mitanni, they spoke the Hurrian, which is not a Semitic language either. And while the Egyptians, they are technically they're closely related to Near Eastern populations, specifically the Natufians of the Paleolithic and Neolithic farmers. Uh, they were they were not Semitic. I mean, they had Semitic immigrants that would come in during the uh, Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom, but the native Egyptians, they didn't speak a Semitic language. Their language, while it's Afro-Asiatic and it's related to the Semitic language, they spoke a different language, and they, yeah, they weren't the natives weren't of Semitic descent. They were, I mean, they you can make the case, or there's actually a pretty strong case that they share a common ancestry with the Semitic peoples in the early farmers of the Middle East, but Egyptians were a separate population.
The third geographic area.
Wait, let me see here. Um, but yeah, other than those groups, for the most part, uh, the peoples of the ancient Near East were Semitic, and specifically, with the Assyrians and the whether it be the Kassite, Amorite, Babylonians, yeah, everyone else, and also the Akkadians, everyone else was Semitic.
Wealthy at the time of Muhammad, but also politically subservient. The native peoples are Semites relatives of the Arabs. The third geographic area being the deserts of Arabia. Ironically, even though they were literally neighbors to the oldest civilizations in the world at the time of Muhammad, the Arabs were uncivilized tribes that had maintained independence. The area is dead dry and divided between nomadic tribes and city-states that maintained independence.
While the Arab tribes were nomads, I wouldn't, you know, um, uh, the word uncivilized. I mean, I don't know if I would go that far. I mean, obviously they were nomadic, and um, but I don't know if he's going to point this out, but the Arabs were making contact with civilizations of the Iron Age Near East, specifically through the Trans-Arabian incense, or overall Trans-Arabian trade that brought goods such as frankincense, gum, myrrh, and those were traded throughout uh, the Levant and the Near East, and this was facilitated by the Assyrians. But um, let me go back. Actually, let me go back a little bit.
Civilizations in the world at the time of Muhammad, the Arabs were uncivilized tribes that had maintained independence.
And there were cities such as Mecca that were pretty sophisticated as well.
The area is dead dry and divided between nomadic tribes and city-states which are clustered around oases and are the trade depots.
Okay, so he did mention the city states. But yeah, um, it's interesting that he brings up the trade depots because these um, Arab city states on the coast, such as Mecca and the other ones in the map, they were part of a network called the Red Sea states that did include the Abyssinians, or what is today the Horn of Africa, the cultures of the Horn of Africa, Egypt, and then also the peoples of like the more southerly part of the Near East. And um, very, these cities got pretty wealthy because of the goods that were traded, and there was a lot of opportunity in the Red Sea trade.
which are clustered around oases and are the trade depots. The Bedouin tribes of the Arabian Desert are a constant in history. They were there 4,000 years ago with Abraham and are still the
There's zero evidence that Abraham ever existed. I mean, maybe, uh, maybe I'm just nitpicking a little bit, not focusing on the overall narrative. But yeah, I just should point out that Abraham probably never existed, and there's zero evidence that he ever existed or any of the other patriarchal figures from Genesis. Um, but yeah, the archaeological evidence points to how the stories from Genesis and the people from or the figures from Genesis, um, they did not exist, and the events from Genesis did not happen in the real world.
elite guard of the Saudi military today. The Bedouins have largely been doing the same thing in that whole time period, bringing their herds through the desert, waging intertribal war between clans, and all that. The Arabs had attacked the neighboring peoples of the Fertile Crescent for 3,000 years before Muhammad. The Akkadians, Babylonians, and even Jews were previous Arab peoples that had carved.
Wait, let me go back. I wouldn't say the Bedouin. I mean, the Bedouins, I think the Near Eastern civilizations were aware of them, but in terms of Arab tribes, I mean, I'm trying to remember. There might have been some skirmishes, or uh, I think there were some skirmishes between the Arab tribes and civilizations of the ancient Near East. But um, I believe, and also, actually, first let me go back.
The Fertile Crescent for 3,000 years before Muhammad. The Akkadians, Babylonians, and even Jews were previous Arab peoples that had carved out kingdoms in the civilized world.
Yeah, I would not call the uh, Jews, Akkadians, and what was the other one? Hold on.
Peoples that had carved out kingdoms in the civilized world years before Muhammad. The Akkadians, Babylonians, and even Jews
Oh yeah,
were
Babylonians. Well,
previous Arab peoples that had carved out.
yeah, the Jews, Akkadians, and Babylonians weren't Arabs. They were, as I mean, he just actually mentioned this before, so maybe this was a mistake, but they were Semitic. They all spoke Semitic languages, and they're related to Arabs. But um, yeah, especially like the Babylonians, whether it be the Amorite uh, Babylonian dynasty or old Amorite Babylonian dynasty, or the Kassites or the Chaldeans, they would have come from the more northerly or um, northern part of like the Near East, more like probably like the what is today northern Syria, or possibly from the Levantine coast. And then um, obviously the Israelites were indigenous to Canaan, and they did make contact with peoples from the Transjordan, such as the Midianites and Edomites and Moabites. But um, and also, yeah, also the Akkadians probably came from like the Levantine coast and eventually settled in was today southern Iraq, similar to the Babylonians, or the various waves of Babylonian settlement. Um, but yeah, they weren't Arabs though. Um, and within the context of like the pre-Islamic Middle East, I'm surprised he hasn't brought up like how or stuff like the the Trans-Arabian trade that was facilitated by the Assyrians, or how, or like Trans-Jordan cultures such as the Midianites, who probably had contact with the, or actually, there's proof that they had contact with the Israelites um, through trade, and there's even evidence that there were Midianites living in Israelite settlements. Um, and for yeah, also he hasn't brought up like any other Transjordan cultures, such as the uh, even if you go into like classical antiquity, such as like Petra, or uh, I don't think he's brought up um, uh, what's it called, Palmyra, which was like the um, absolute center, or hub of trade between the Arabian Peninsula, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the wider Near East. Because when I think of like the pre-Islamic Middle East, and setting the scene or the background of the rise of Islam, I think establishing that there were connections between um, the Arabian Peninsula, peoples from the Arabian Peninsula, the Levant, wider Near East, and Eastern Mediterranean, due to city-states such as Palmyra and Petra, um, and even I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, but the Nabatean kingdoms. Um, I think that's important to bring up within this context.
Kingdoms in the civilized world. The Semitic peoples have shared many deep cultural similarities for their whole story. The brilliant German historian Oswald Spengler, in fact, liked to say that the Islamic
Uh, you got to be careful about who you cite. I mean, I could be wrong, but isn't Oswald Spengler, wasn't he like the German nationalist or something? Uh, Maybe someone can fact check me on that, but I believe I read that somewhere.
Oswald Spengler, in fact, liked to say that the Islamic Wald Spengler, in fact, liked to say that the Islamic Caliphate under Muhammad was an endpoint of already thousands of year old civilization that stemmed back to the Jews under
Actually,
Moses. This
let me hear
argument
this whole
the
argument.
Islamic Caliphate under peoples that had carved out kingdoms in the civilized world. The Semitic peoples have shared many deep cultural similarities for their whole story. The brilliant German historian Oswald Spengler, in fact, liked to say that the Islamic Caliphate under Muhammad was an endpoint of already thousands of year old civilization that stemmed back to the Jews under Moses. This
Well, first off, same way that Abraham never existed, Moses most likely never existed. Um, that's pretty much consensus within biblical scholarship and biblical archaeology. And also, the events in Exodus never happened. The archaeological evidence shows that um, both the Israelites were indigenous to Canaan, and also they were never in Egypt. Um, but in terms of Islamic civilization being like the end point, or let me go back to see how it's phrased. But hold on.
the Islamic Caliphate under Muhammad was an endpoint of already thousands of year old civilization.
So basically, endpoint or culmination of a very old, I guess, pan Near Eastern civilization that started with uh, Moses and the Jews. Although, like I said, that's um, ahistorical because Moses did not exist, and also um, I wouldn't call, I wouldn't say there was like a straight trajectory from like the ancient, maybe the Iron Age Near East all the way to uh, Islamic civilization. I wouldn't say it's a clean trajectory. I mean, um, you know, he's going to point out the similarities, but that's easily attributed to the fact that you know Muhammad, first and foremost, was obviously a merchant, and he's from Mecca, and he had his engaged in trade in Mecca, or would have engaged in trade in Mecca. So uh, he and Mecca, there was a lot of contact with Near Eastern Christians and Jews in the pre-Islamic Middle East, and also like on the eve of Islam, the rise of Islam. So he would have had contact with Christians and Jews. So he would have gotten the ideas for Islam from his interactions with them. And yeah, overall the influence of or the similarities between Islam and the other Abrahamic faiths is, the easiest or the most simple explanation is uh, due to, contact with Christians and Jews in city states such as Mecca. Um, but yeah, I wouldn't. The other reason why I wouldn't say it's a straight trajectory, her historical trajectory from the Iron Age Near East to the uh, Islamic Near East is because you had in between the, let's say, the Assyrian or Babylonian occupied Near East and Persian occupied Near East, you there was interruptions such as Alexander the Great's empire, uh, or Alexander the Great and Macedonian Empire conquering the Near East and his empire stretching all the way to what is today northern India. Um, and then obviously the Roman occupation or conquest of the Middle East. Um, there's going to be obvious cultural influence, such as with Greek, um, you know, in the Hellenistic Near East, you had Greek cities that were set up, and obviously there was, um, and they were set up in they were Greek style cities because you had like theaters and Greek style temples. But then you had other things, your phenomena, such as religious syncretism, butchered that pronunciation, but religious syncretism, where, um, for example, this occurred a lot in Egypt, where Greek religion and Egyptian religion, there would be sort of a fusing uh, or conflation of certain deities, such as an example would be Serapis, um, and um, you know, it, you know, I would say overall the Hellenistic and Roman influence on the Middle East and North Africa, um, sort of that's like the big one of the bigger issues with this thesis that uh, Islamic civilization is the culmination of a thousands of year trajectory from the Iron Age Near East.
that stem back to the Jews under Moses. This argument does have some validity.
Now, you could make the argument that um, since the Persian Empire or the Persian influence on the Middle East, um, you that with Zoroastrianism, like those ideas spreading, and then Jews coming into contact with Zoroastrianism and that having influence on Second Temple Judaism, there, uh, that's sort of another interesting point that could be brought up. And then you know that's where the Second Temple Judaism gets gets the ideas of like sort of this dualism between the all powerful, omniscient, uh, immaterial God uh, of the Second Temple Judaism, and then that dualism with the sort of malevolent evil entity that is Satan, which Satan, Second Temple, the Second Temple idea of Satan was influenced by the Zoroastrian and Ahriman, and then Ahura Mazda as sort of the uh, omniscient, all-knowing deity has had a lot of influence on the Second Temple uh, version of Yahweh or God. So you can make the case that there's sort of a lineage that of the uh, of the Islamic religion that goes back to Zoroastrianism. And then obviously what complicates that more is uh, once the Arabs conquer Persia, then they come into contact again with these Zoroastrian ideas and beliefs, and then that sort of has an influence on Islam as well. Um, but but then that goes back to the argument I was making that rather than it being a trajectory or a culmination or end to a single civilization, uh, rather it's just you know, excuse me, early Muslims coming into uh, contact with Abrahamic ideas when they encounter Christian and Jewish merchants in Mecca, um, who in turn were influenced by Zoroastrianism during the Persian Empire.
To it, given that you can see an awful lot of cultural connections that stretch from Moses' time to Muhammad's. They all believed in a harsh but loving, inhuman God that cared a lot about ritual taboos, like many in both Judaism
Uh, Go back.
and Muhammad's. They all believed in a harsh but loving, inhuman God that cared a lot.
Rather, it sounds like he's making the case that this is a unique civilization that stretches back to the time of Moses and the Jews and ends with Islamic civilization. But then the obvious counter argument is that the first temple or Iron Age era Israelite god, Yahweh, was no different than any other storm warrior god from the ancient Near East, such as Baal or Chemosh, Chemosh of the Moabites, or uh, those are just two examples. But yeah, he was, as Mark Smith, the author of The Early History of God, pointed out, Yahweh, the God of the Israelites and Jews, came out of a world of Near Eastern gods. So he wasn't some unique, immaterial uh, God who was harsh but all loving. He was actually pretty wrathful, and like any other Near Eastern God, he could get angry if you know, as what happens in the Bible, the Israelites start worshiping other gods, or they do something that displeases him, then he'll abandon them. And this occurs in other examples of Near Eastern literature, um, where uh, where it's apparent that a deity abandons uh, a city state or people. But yeah, I that's the obvious counter argument to this picture or this argument that's being made uh, about the this harsh but all loving deity that uh, and within this trajectory of to with that ends with the Islamic civilization.
Ritual taboos, like many in both Judaism, being the consumption of pork, circumcision. They despise icons. They both had prophets rise up to give them a strict moral code around which they could construct their societies. They
Now, uh, thing about this with the
of
prophets.
pork, circumcision. They despise icons. They both had prophets.
Well, actually, first with the icons, that's more of a development within later Israelite and Jewish religion, because that even as late as like the 8th to 7th century BCE, there were depictions of Yahweh and other deities that have been found by archaeologists in Israel. Um, but so yeah, it wasn't. Maybe I'm not. I hope I'm not like straw manning or misrepresenting this argument, but it wasn't. Um, I don't think it's accurate to paint this uh, this civilization as like a continuous, uh, barely changing, or uh, um, you know, uh, you know, like sort, uh, uh, I'm trying to figure out how to say this. Um, like I don't think it's accurate to portray uh like or Israelite civilization as sort of the predecessor to Islamic civilization, and sort of like this lineage or trajectory that uh is apparent, like the traits of Islam are apparent within early Israelite religion. I don't like I think that's not super accurate, but um especially with like it being foundational to Israelite civilization, that they despise um, uh, icons and idols when that was a later development.
Prophets rise up to give them a strict moral code around which they could construct their society. Of pork, circumcision, they despise icons. They both had prophets rise up to give them a strict moral code.
Well, and that's the other thing. These, depending on which prophets in the Old Testament he's talking about, like uh, Moses and like Abraham, they did not exist, and these were not historical figures. Now, if he's talking about Isaiah and Elijah, uh, they were, then there's more of a case to be made that they were historical. But I don't know if they rose up. I think they were trying to adhere to strict Yahwehist religion, and like make sure that the Israelites didn't go too far astray, or didn't do things that displeased Yahweh. Um, and while he's comparing, while you can make the case that there is a connection with uh, prophets in the Bible and the Quran, there is actually a difference with how prophets are treated or figures outside of Yahweh are treated in the Old Testament and Israelite, and then Second Temple Judaism versus uh, Islamic civilization. Because I remember in a class I took about King David, one of the we we watched a sort of an just to get an idea of how David has been depicted throughout the ages. We um uh we watched a video from an Muslim YouTube channel that gives like this that tells the story of King David, and King David's face is blurred out because he's considered one of the prophets in Islamic religion, and as most of you know, you're not supposed to show the faces of prophets in uh, Islamic religion. Like you're not allowed to depict them or show their faces. While uh, in Israelite civilization, then Second Temple Judaism, there's nothing, there's no rule against depicting prophets or uh, famous figures from the Old Testament. Um, like you're allowed to show their face. And a good example of that is the Duo Europa synagogue in Syria, where there is a mosaic or depiction of King David, uh, and obviously his face is shown. So the way that Islam and Judaism treats prophets or important figures from their texts, there's a lot of difference there as well.
Around which they could construct their societies. They were both desert herder peoples who established their empire that conquered farming peoples under a theocracy. The French.
It's not entirely accurate with regards to Israel, because let me actually listen to that again.
They were both desert herder peoples who established their empire that conquered farming peoples under a theocracy.
While the at first the Israelites were pastoral pastoral nomads who eventually settled in the highlands of Israel, Palestine. They the archaeological evidence is clear that there was never a empire or a united monarchy under David or Solomon, because at the time when David should have been ruling, the archaeological evidence points to um, uh, Israelite civilization not having expanded outside of various villages and uh, small settlements still in the highlands. The archaeological evidence doesn't point in the direction of what you expect of a united kingdom or large notable kingdom in the Near East or even empire. Um, the, what the archaeological record shows is that the uh, Israelites were still like still we're still living in highland villages and still sort of small time farmers uh, and animal herders at the time when David should have been ruling over his united monarchy. Now, it could be the case that there was a small city state in Jerusalem, not and it would have been a lot smaller than Jerusalem today. It would have been centered on the what is today the Temple Mount. I believe Israel Finkelstein has made that argument, but yeah, regardless, the Israelites did not sweep through the Middle East and North Africa and spread Judaism or Israelite religion by the sword. Um, and yeah, the Israelites never had an empire or united monarchy as the Bible depicts it. Um, uh, yeah, the closest thing was that there were two uh, kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel and Judah, and the northern kingdom of Israel was a more wealthy kingdom. Uh, but yeah, these were never empires, and they never conquered farming peoples and set up a theocracy in the style of the Arab Muslims. Um,
The French historian Fabry likes to imagine the similarities between the Gs. They were both desert herder peoples who established their empire that conquered farming peoples under a theocracy. The French historian Fabry likes to imagine the similarities between the Jews and Muslims, like that between the Romans and Americans or Greeks and Europeans, as ethnically similar societies that operate under many similar close patterns but are still distinct. I like the Spenglerian.
Let me go back. I know I keep going back, but there was something else I wanted to say about the comparison between the Israelites and Arabs and how they supposedly conquered um, and and had like uh, or spread their religion by the sword.
They were both desert herder peoples who established their empire that conquered farming peoples under a theocracy.
And that's the other thing. Islam is a religion of converting people, and they did convert. Like when the Arab Muslims first rose up and started conquering the Middle East and North Africa, they spread Islam by the sword. While Judaism is very exclusive, and it's quite clear that their belief is that the Jews are the chosen people of God, and they're not really a religion that seeks to convert people. It's more of a uh, ethno-religious group, if you will. In fact, um, especially during the Roman era, that they weren't while Christianity while the Christians were out converting people. What set them apart from the Jews was that the Jews weren't seeking to convert people, or they didn't, and especially during the uh, Iron Age. If we go back further, um, the Israelites weren't seeking to conquer peoples and spread their religion by the sword because they didn't really have the ability to, you know, establish a large empire. Uh, with the Syrians and the Egyptians as sort of the Babylonians as well as the major players in the Near East at that time. But I mean, the only evidence we have of the kingdom of Israel at least conquering neighboring peoples is with the Moabite stone that says that the kingdom of Israel did have control of the Moabites, but and this isn't an exact quotation, but the the god Chemosh was on the side of the Moabites, and they were able to drive out the Israelites. Um, but maybe I'm just nitpicking, but um, yeah, I guess overall Islam sought to conquer various lands and spread their religion by the sword, while uh, Judaism and Israelite religion was more exclusive, didn't seek to convert.
French historian Fabry likes to imagine the similarities between the Jews and Muslims, like that between the Romans and Americans or Greeks and Europeans, as ethnically similar societies that.
Again, this is more nitpicking, but I wouldn't say the Americans and Romans were ethnically similar because America is like multiracial, multi-ethnic. Um, and while the Roman Empire was multicultural, it's not in the same way that the Americans or America is. Um, and obviously, I've said this before, but um, Europe, I wouldn't call it a genetic monolith. So to say that the Greeks are genetically similar to uh, all Europeans is kind of painting a broad brush.
Similarities between the Jews and Muslims, like that between the Romans and Americans or Greeks and Europeans, as ethnically similar societies that operate under many similar close patterns but are still distinct. I like the Spenglerian argument that Islam is an endpoint of an already old philosophy, since it's not like Muhammad saw himself as the inventor of a completely new tradition, rather as the culmination of something that had started thousands of years before.
Okay, so he's acknowledging the Zoroastrian influence of both Judaism and, by extension, Islam.
Stretching back to Moses or Abraham, with the Arabs even seeing themselves as brothers with the Jews, as children of Abraham, and Muhammad calling himself the last prophet of that tradition. The genius of
Should be pointed out that in Islamic society, Christians and Jews, while they were seen as people of the book, they were treated as second-class citizens or dhimmi who had to pay more in taxes.
the Semitic peoples is they continually produce prophets. The moral codes that Muhammad pulled from had already existed for a very long time, and Spengler viewed Muhammad as something like a Western Puritan movement or an attempt to solidify and perfect a pre-existing cultural tradition. The thing that makes this movement very difficult to tease out is that the Semitic civilization that had been percolating beneath the surface was ruled by foreign dynasties, and thus we can't see the direct outcomes of its evolution. The Middle East was
All right, so I guess here he's kind of acknowledging that there's not a direct trajectory from Israelite or Jewish civilization uh, to Islamic civilization or to the Islamic philosophy, as he said.
divided before Muhammad and split between Persian and Greek-speaking conquerors. The Semites were quite wealthy and cultured, but they were colonized. However, at the same time, we have to be fair that Islam was really something new. What Muhammad orchestrated was a mass rebellion by the Semitic peoples that allowed them to rise to global predominance.
I wouldn't say it's kind of a weird way to. I'll say that it's a weird way to kind of phrase that because it wasn't a rebellion by Semitic peoples in general. It was basically Muhammad united the Arab tribes and conquered other Arab tribes. And then after his death, uh, peoples from the Arabian Peninsula conquered the territories in the Middle East and North Africa. I wouldn't frame this as a rebellion of Semitic peoples in general.
His creation of Islam is one of the most remarkable events in all of world history. A single man really formed an entire civilization. a mass rebellion by the Semitic peoples that allowed them to rise to global predominance. His creation, at the same time, we have to be fair that Islam was really something new. What Muhammad orchestrated was a mass rebellion by the Semitic peoples that allowed them to rise to global predominance. His creation of Islam is one of the most remarkable events in all of world history. A single man really formed an entire civilization. By creating the political and religious structure that would allow the Arabs to spread across the whole known world, lasting until the present. Muhammad may be the most important person in the whole history of the world for pulling this off. With European, Chinese, and Indian civilization, they formed over thousands of years, and there's no single person you can point to who definitively built them, but there is for Islam. It's pretty common for a region to make a religion, then try to convert to it, fail, export
it. Maybe certain people disagree with my argument or rebuttal of this, but I feel like there would be historians of Islamic civilization or Muslim scholars who would kind of disagree with that, framing that Muhammad is the single-handedly the man responsible for the entirety of Islamic civilization, because you know one could point out how with the Abbasid Caliphate and sort of the influence of Persian civilization on the Abbasid Caliphate that had, and the various you know Muslim scholars throughout the Middle Ages also had an influence on Islamic civilization. Um, like it's similar to how you wouldn't. I mean, you could say that Jesus is the sole figure responsible for Christianity and the rise of Christianity, but that kind of ignores like the contributions of people like, um, the Apostle Paul or uh, Christian theologians from antiquity in the early and late Middle Ages as well. Um, but yeah, so the same thing with Islam. It's kind of ignoring uh, Muslim poets and scholars from the Middle Ages and the contributions of the Abbasid Caliphate as well.
it to another civilization where it sets much deeper roots before converting to something approximating what it had earlier. This happened in India and the Far East with Buddhism, Western Europe and Asia with Marxism, and in the Middle East and Europe with Christianity and Islam. Through the process of converting the mostly European Roman Empire and through adoption by Greek-speaking Jews, Christianity morphed into a religion largely for Europeans.
Mm, I mean, that's kind of ignoring how Christianity was very much present and had a large presence in places like Egypt, and then how there's there was a strong Christian presence and still is in the Middle East, even though they're a minority and they're a large minority in Egypt today. But these Christians in the Middle East and North Africa do exist, and it's not I wouldn't call it a religion for Europeans for this reason.
Leaving out the elements that made it attractive to the Semites. Semitic peoples like an all-powerful, overpowered, inhuman god who doesn't like
Um, well, assuming by inhuman he means, I don't know if he means like omniscient and immaterial, or just like your typical, or just like a super powerful deity in the vein of like ancient Near Eastern deities. But let me go back to listen to it again.
Semitic peoples like an all-powerful, overpowered, inhuman god who doesn't like idols, and
I wouldn't just to generalize about Semitic peoples, especially like ancient Semitic peoples, because in obviously the Bronze Age and Iron Age, Semitic peoples, they had idols, and all of them, including the Israelites, were worshiping a multitude of gods and goddesses and used idols to represent them. Um, and yeah, this idea that they Semitic peoples in general liked the idea of a all-powerful immaterial god who doesn't like idols is, I don't know, that not entirely accurate.
has all kinds of ritual prescriptions. The gods in the Middle East are like their sun in deserts. Unlike Western Europe's more human and forgiving Christians that made it attractive to the Semites. Semitic peoples like an all-powerful, overpowered, inhuman god who doesn't like idols and has all kinds of ritual prescriptions. The gods in the Middle East are like their sun in deserts. Unlike Western Europe's more human and forgiving Christian gods.
So sounds like he's making more of an environmental argument. Um, I mean, and also to portray all Middle Eastern gods as a reflection of the deserts and sun that ignores like fertility goddesses such as Asherah or Asatarte, um, who weren't in any way associated with the, or gods of the sea such as the Canaanite Yam. That sort of ignores um, the that sort of ignores like the multitude of gods in the ancient Near East that served different purposes, and they weren't uh, all connected to the sun or the desert.
Unlike Western Europe, gods in the Middle East are like their sun in deserts. Unlike Western Europe's more human and forgiving Christian god, like their wet, fertile, temperate climate. This is
And should be pointed out that Western Europeans didn't all have, or not all of their gods were like, and I know he's talking about the Christian God in this case, but in terms of influence, and if he's going to make an environmental argument that the gods are going to reflect like a temperate climate, you know, um, uh, that wasn't always the case, and there were a lot of gods who weren't like forgiving and see how else he describes it.
human and forgiving Christian god, like their unlike Western Europe's more human and forgiving Christian god, like their wet.
Yeah, like the okay, more human and forgiving. I would, if you take a look at ancient Greek mythology, um, you know, one only needs to pull up examples of like Zeus punishing King Minos with by giving him a monstrous half bull, half human son, or Athena punishing Medusa for getting raped in her temple by Poseidon by turning her into a gorgon. Those don't sound like forgiving gods, uh, or more human or forgiving gods in the way that he's describing Jesus in this case. So this is going to be, I guess, the part two or second half of my reaction video to What If Alt History's Understanding Islamic Civilization, because my electricity went out and ended the first part of the reaction video. So this is the second half. We ended on the part where he was making the environmental argument for Semitic gods versus, or the Semitic interpretation or uh, Semitic version of the Abrahamic God, basically the more Old Testament and Quranic or Islamic Abrahamic God versus the European Christian God, where he's saying the temperate climate influences the forgiving Christian God versus the Semitic God that's very concerned with law codes. But uh, I guess just to put a pin in that, uh, especially with the how the Semitics or Semitic peoples are generalized with regards to which gods they tend to worship or if they gravitate towards an all-powerful, omniscient God concerned with law or that prescribes certain law codes. Let's go back to see how exactly he phrased it.
That made it attractive to the Semites. Semitic peoples like an all-powerful, overpowered, inhuman god who doesn't like idols, and who.
And I think I addressed this the last time. I mean, obviously, many Semitic civilizations, especially in the Bronze Age and Iron Age, had idols and depictions of their gods. But also, this idea of an all-powerful, omniscient, inhuman god, sort of like the Abrahamic God that the three faiths are familiar with today. I would say that's more of a product of Persian or Zoroastrian influence during the post-Babylonian uh, period, the Persian period of Israel's history that was brought up in the first half of this reaction video. And obviously, the Persians are Indo-European people and they're not Semitic. Uh, the Semitic, in fact, you can make the case that the Semitic version of Yahweh was more of a storm warrior god that was more similar to like other Semitic gods such as Chemosh of the Moabites or Baal of the Ugaritic in the Canaanite and Phoenicians. Um, but yeah, the idea of an omniscient, in fact, the idea of an omniscient God is both Zoroastrian, like a all-knowing, omniscient God that's inhuman and immaterial, is more Zoroastrian and Neoplatonic, which is a product of Greek philosophy. So those two sources provide the Abrahamic faiths with the omniscient, inhuman God more so than Semitic civilization.
Then oppress the Semitic sects of Christianity like the Nestorians or Copts.
Again, another nitpick, but the Copts aren't Semitic. They don't speak a Semitic language. The language they speak is actually descended from ancient Egyptian, the ancient Egyptian language, and the Copts are, their language is related to the Semitic languages. They're both Afro-Asiatic, but they're not. They don't speak Semitic languages. They speak Coptic, which is more closely related to ancient Egyptian than something like Hebrew.
In all honesty, the Prophet Muhammad was an absolute Chad. If I wasn't a Christian, I might make a virgin Jesus dies on cross and says be kind, versus Chad Muhammad meme, who established a complete legal code, transcribed God's exact words, waged and won wars, and then formed the structure for what quickly became the largest empire in history up to its.
I mean, yeah, Jesus was more of a non-violent religious figure who spread his faith through preaching and teaching. He was a preacher teacher from Galilee, although the historical Jesus is more of a messianic figure. In that comes the expectation that he was going to uh, be a political figure that would defeat God's enemies, which is Rome, and then establish God's kingdom on earth. But that never happened. But anyways, yeah, traditionally Jesus is more nonviolent and advocates for peace, while yeah, Muhammad and the Arabs spread Islam by the sword and through conquest, and that's actually how Muhammad united the Arab tribes, but through conquest.
Point. Christianity and Islam are by all accounts pretty similar religions. Both are monotheistic, Abrahamic religions made in geographically the exact same areas.
I mean, I guess in a broad, simplistic sense, they're both from quote unquote the Middle East, but um, I mean, if you want to get more specific, uh, Islam was born in the very desert region of Saudi Arabia, so very, very dry, hot desert environment, while Jesus's ministry and movement was centered in Galilee, which is like more of a uh, hilly, fertile environment. And then, one of the you could argue the second most important figure in Christianity, Paul the Apostle. Uh, his he is from Asia Minor, and his ministry was broadly centered around the Eastern Mediterranean in various parts, such as various Greek uh, regions, such as Corinth uh, and then various parts of Asia Minor, and also he seems to have had travel to Rome at some point. But yeah, broadly, his is a Mediterranean movement. So not exactly geographic. I wouldn't say the exact same geographic location.
That view the same texts as holy and worship the same God. The Muslims have viewed the Jews and Christians as their cousins and all people of the book. However,
Although there should be a caveat with this: the Christians and Jews, especially in the medieval Islamic world, were treated as second-class citizens or dhimmi, So basically, they had to pay more in taxes if they were going to live as Christians under Islamic rule. Not that they were, persecuted per se, although to bring up an example from Al Andalus or Islamic Spain, even though there was relative, uh, peace and uh, coexistence between the Muslims, Jews, and Christians during certain periods of rule, say under Ibn al-Rahman, uh, you know, later in the 11th century, like around the mid 11th century, there was a radical Muslim faction from North Africa that invaded, and then they took a look at, sort of the kumbaya getting along that between the Muslims, Christians, and Jews, and it's like, what is this? This is not right. It's not how you're supposed to practice Islam. And then they persecuted the Christians and Jews and established a more tyrannical, radical Muslim rule. Uh, because they disagreed with, uh, coexisting and, well, not coexisting, but sort of living in harmony with the Christians and Jews, the way that the Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula were previously had.
However, Christianity and Islam do have some very key differences that it's important to tease out. As my friend Kurt Doolittle likes to say, small differences over
And
large.
also, should bring up another example during the Crusades. First, uh, historians have pointed out that one of the causes, not the only cause, but one of the causes for the Crusades and Pope Urban's call to invade the Holy Land and reconquer it was the fact that Christian pilgrims were being attacked and persecuted by Muslims in the Middle East and North Africa. Um, and then also, when the crusading army of the First Crusade was making its way down the Levant, I believe in Syria, the there was a let me try to remember which battle it was, or um, which city they had. It was actually the battle at Antioch. So it was the siege of Antioch where the crusading Christians or the Christian army was attempting to uh, lay siege to Antioch, and then the ruler or the general of the Muslims, Yagi Sion, basically persecuted, uh, victimized, or uh, attacked the native Christian population of Antioch, and the Greek patriarch was then dangled by his feet from the battlements. So the even though they're Christians and Jews are considered people of the book, it wasn't always you know co-peaceful or a peaceful coexistence between these three sects of the Abrahamic religions.
Amounts of people over long periods of time can make the greatest differences in the whole world. I'm not even sure if these are differences in what Muhammad or Jesus even taught, but rather how their respective civilizations applied their religions. There are a couple moments in history that so perfectly encapsulate some massive cultural or philosophic point, and one of those perfect moments is when a Muslim conqueror was entering Jerusalem during some war in the Middle Ages, I think the Crusades, and he said, "The weak Christians, they let their God die on the cross." This one line encapsulates all of the differences between Islam.
Uh, actually, let me go back to make sure, see what exactly
What Muhammad
and
or
get his
Jesus
words
even
right.
taught, but rather how their respective civilizations applied their religion in the
So I
Middle
guess
Ages.
on that point, how the prospective Muslim and Christian civilizations applied their religion, I guess it should be pointed out that Muslim civilization, or I should say, the manner in which Islam spread its religion through conquest, it should be pointed out that uh, so basically, I guess in a broader sense, both the Christian civilization and Muslim civilization took advantage of certain factors or uh, certain historical things that were going on in different ways. So with the Muslim civilization, they took advantage of the how the Byzantine Empire and the Sasanian or Neo-Persian Empire were weakened by their previous war that they had, and also that their resources were drained. And so in this instance, or in that moment, they took advantage and conquered the Middle East and North Africa, i.e., spread Islam by the sword. While Christianity, the difference is Jesus was, uh, spread his message through uh, preaching throughout the Galilee and Judea, and then later after Jesus died, Paul spread his message through his ministry by going to various uh, city states and cities and regions throughout the Eastern Mediterranean and even Rome itself. Um, so in that instance, Christianity or the Christian movement took advantage of the sophisticated and wide network of roads that the Roman Empire had built, and also they took advantage of the pretty much the superhighway that was the Mediterranean. Um, but they took advantage of that to spread their religion through conversion and speaking to the to various pagan populations. But yeah, that's one difference that should be pointed out in how those religions spread. But I think I'm gonna end my reaction video here because this video is 42 minutes long, and that would take me like 3 to 4 hours to react to this whole thing and get my thoughts out. But overall, this was an interesting video. I disagreed with certain things and sort of had to nitpick certain inaccuracies, but overall, it was a interesting video.